Let me paint you a picture. Imagine a country so rich, so confident, so absolutely convinced of its own invincibility that its real estate was worth more than the entire United States of America. Combined, not a neighborhood, not a city, an entire country, slightly smaller than California, worth more than every single acre of American soil. I'm not making that up. At the peak of Japan's bubble economy in 1989, the land under the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, a building you cannot buy, a building no one will ever sell, was estimated to be worth more than the entire state of California. Let that sink in for a second. One palace, one California, same price, and then it all collapsed spectacularly, painfully, and in slow motion, like watching a skyscraper fall over one floor at a time for 30 years. This is the story of Japan's asset bubble, the most expensive economic delusion in modern history, and a story that, if you're paying attention, sounds disturbingly familiar right now. The Statter. To understand how Japan lost its mind, you need to understand how Japan found its confidence. After World War II, Japan was a country in ashes, literally. American firebombing had leveled most of its major cities. Its economy was shattered, its pride was gone, and it had just surrendered unconditionally to a foreign power for the first time in its entire history. Not exactly a promising start. But here's the thing about Japan. When they decide to do something, they do it with a level of collective discipline that makes the rest of the world look lazy. By the 1960s, Japan was rebuilding. Fast. By the 1970s, Japanese cars and electronics were flooding global markets. Toyota, Sony, Honda. These weren't just companies, they were weapons of economic warfare. And by the 1980s, Japan wasn't just recovered. Japan was dominant. GDP was growing at 4 to 5% a year. Unemployment was practically non-existent. Japanese companies were buying American landmarks, Rockefeller Center, Pebble Beach Golf Course, Hollywood studios. Japanese tourists were traveling the world and paying cash for everything. Japan wasn't just rich, Japan felt invincible. And when a country feels invincible, it stops asking uncomfortable questions, like, is any of this actually real? The fuel every great bubble needs fuel. And Japan's bubble had the most explosive fuel available: cheap money, government policy, and pure unadulterated greed. Here's how the machine worked. In 1985, the major world powers, the US, UK, Germany, France, and Japan, signed something called the Plaza Accord. The goal was to weaken the US dollar, which sounds boring. But the side effect for Japan was catastrophic in the best possible way. At first, a stronger yen made Japanese exports more expensive abroad, which hurt manufacturers. So to compensate, the Bank of Japan slashed interest rates aggressively. Rates went from 5% down to 2.5%. Suddenly, borrowing money in Japan was basically free. And when money is basically free, people do not behave rationally. They never have. They never will. Banks started lending recklessly. Companies borrowed to invest in more companies. Ordinary Japanese salarymen took out massive loans to buy stocks. And everyone piled into real estate. Why real estate? Because of a belief so deeply embedded in Japanese culture, it was practically religion. Land in Japan is finite. The country is mostly mountains and coastline. There's simply not enough of it. Therefore, land prices can only go up. It's the Japanese version of they're not making more of it. And with cheap loans flooding the market, land prices became completely untethered from reality. Between 1985 and 1991, Japanese real estate prices tripled. In Tokyo, they went up 5 times over. People were taking out 100-year mortgages. Not 30-year, not 50-year, 100 years. Designed to be paid off by your grandchildren. And nobody thought that was insane. That was just Tuesday in 1989 Japan. The peak. Let's talk about the stock market, because the insanity there was on a completely different level. The Nikkei 225, Japan's version of the S&P 500, started the 1980s at around 6,000 points. By December 1989, it hit 38,916. That's a 550% increase in less than a decade. Put that in perspective, that's like if the S&P 500 went from its current levels to somewhere around 28,000 in the next 9 years. Japanese stocks weren't priced on earnings. They weren't priced on growth. They were priced on vibes, on confidence, on the collective hallucination that this was Japan, and Japan didn't lose. At the peak, Japanese companies made up 45% of global stock market value. Japan, a country of 120 million people, controlled nearly half of the entire world's publicly traded wealth. The 5 largest companies in the world by market cap. All Japanese banks, not tech companies, not energy giants. Japanese banks were valued more than entire economies. And the loans backing those valuations, secured against real estate that was also priced in a parallel dimension. It was leverage on top of leverage, on top of leverage, all the way down. And at every single cocktail party, in every boardroom, in every Tokyo taxi, the consensus was the same. This time it's different. Japan is different. This is just how it works now. The collapse then came 1990, and reality, as it always does, showed up uninvited. The Bank of Japan had finally noticed that something might be slightly off about a palace being worth the state of California, so they raised interest rates sharply, 5 times in a single year, from 2.5% all the way to 6%. The free money was gone, and when the free money disappears, the magic disappears with it. The Nikkei crashed 39% in 1990 alone. It kept falling and falling and falling. By 2003, the Nikkei had lost 80% of its peak value, 80%. Gone. Real estate followed the same script, just slower and more agonizing. Tokyo property prices fell for 15 consecutive years. 15. People who had bought at the peak watched their property lose 70 to 80% of its value, while still making payments on their 100-year mortgage. Think about that for a moment. You are paying off a loan every single month on an asset that is worth a fraction of what you owe. And you will be doing this for the rest of your life, and your children's lives. That's not a recession, that's a financial horror movie. The banking system essentially collapsed. Japanese banks were sitting on mountains of loans backed by assets that had lost most of their value. Bad debt piled up, banks stopped lending, companies stopped investing, consumers stopped spending. Japan entered what economists would politely call a lost decade. 1 decade became 2, 2 became 3. The Nikkei 225 didn't return to its 1989 peak until, and I want you to really hear this, 2024, 35 years later, not 8 years like the Nifty 50, not 3 years like the dot-com bust, 35 years. An entire generation of Japanese people never experienced economic growth as adults. A generation that grew up being told Japan was unstoppable, watched their country stagnate for their entire working lives. That's what happens when you let a bubble get that big. The parallels now. Let's play a little game called, Does Any of This Sound Familiar? In 1989 Japan, interest rates were kept artificially low for years, pumping cheap money into the economy and inflating asset prices. After 2008 and again after 2020, the US Federal Reserve kept rates near zero for over a decade. Asset prices, stocks, real estate, crypto, went absolutely vertical. In 1989 Japan, real estate was treated as a one-way bet, a sure thing, an asset that simply could not go down. Sound like any housing market conversations you've had recently? In 1989 Japan, the top companies made up a wildly disproportionate share of total market value, and their valuations had disconnected from any rational measure of earnings. Today, the Magnificent Seven, Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon, Meta, Tesla, and Nvidia, make up 36% of the entire S&P 500. Some of them are trading at valuations that require a very active imagination to justify. And perhaps most importantly, in 1989 Japan, everyone knew prices were high. Everyone could see the math didn't work. But no one wanted to be the person who left the party early, because the music was still playing, the drinks were still flowing, and surely, someone else would be holding the bag when it ended. History doesn't repeat itself. But as Mark Twain didn't actually say, but everyone quotes anyway, it does rhyme. Now look, I'm not here to tell you the sky is falling. Maybe it isn't. Maybe the Magnificent Seven really will grow into their valuations. Maybe AI really does change everything. Maybe this time actually is different. But here's what I know for certain. In 1989, the smartest, most educated, most experienced investors in Japan, people who had built and managed real wealth, looked at the most expensive market in history and said, "This makes sense. This is justified. This will continue." And they were catastrophically wrong. The most dangerous thing in investing isn't volatility. It isn't even losing money. The most dangerous thing is certainty. The absolute unshakable conviction that you know how the story ends. Because markets have a very long memory and a very short tolerance for arrogance. Jesse Livermore said it best. There's nothing new in Wall Street. Whatever happens in the stock market today has happened before and will happen again. Japan happened before. The only question is, are we paying attention this time?